No assistant survived a month with the ruthless CEO until the stubborn, clumsy girl showed up. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to the main character. Meet Matthew Blackwell, the ruthless CEO everyone feared. In the fast-paced, cutthroat world of business, Matthew had earned a reputation as a man no one could stand up to. No assistant had lasted more than a month under his watch. His sharp eyes, cold demeanor, and uncompromising nature made it impossible for anyone to keep up with his relentless pace. He had it all: power, wealth, and control, but somehow, that was never enough. In fact, it only fueled his dissatisfaction. The countless assistants he'd gone through were all the same: nervous, unqualified, and incapable of handling his high expectations. To Matthew, they were disposable, nothing more than fleeting figures in his quest for perfection. But little did he know, things were about to change. Enter Sophie Thompson, a young woman with a heart full of determination and a mind bursting with creativity. She wasn't like the others. Sophie had a reputation of her own, not in the world of business, but for being stubborn and clumsy. Despite her lack of experience, she had a drive that many of her peers lacked. Sophie didn't come from a prestigious background, nor did she have the polished resume most CEOs would look for. But she was willing to take on any challenge that came her way. When Sophie walked into Blackwell Enterprises for her first day as Matthew's new assistant, she was met with the usual cold stare. Matthew didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I expect perfection. Anything less is unacceptable," he said in his usual tone of authority. Sophie nodded, determined not to show fear. She was here to prove herself. But it wasn't long before she realized just how impossible her task would be. From the moment she sat at her desk, she fumbled through her tasks. Files were misplaced, emails were sent to the wrong people, and she accidentally spilled coffee all over a very important presentation. The first few days were a nightmare, and Matthew's disapproval was palpable. Yet, Sophie didn't back down. She kept trying, failing, and trying again. What Matthew didn't know was that Sophie had a knack for thinking outside the box. While she might not have known the ins and outs of corporate strategy, she had an uncanny ability to come up with innovative solutions in the most unexpected moments. But that's a story for later. For now, it was clear, Matthew Blackwell was not going to make it easy for Sophie Thompson. She would have to prove herself in ways no one before her had ever been asked to. And that would be harder than anything she'd ever done before. Matthew Blackwell leaned back in his high-backed chair, his sharp eyes scanning the latest report on his desk. The office was quiet, almost unnervingly so, as the rest of the staff had long since left for the day. But Matthew never left before the job was done. That was his rule, his mantra: perfection at all costs. He wasn't interested in excuses, and he certainly wasn't interested in someone who couldn't keep up with his pace. And then there was Sophie Thompson, his newest assistant, who seemed to make a habit of failing at every turn. It wasn't that she didn't try. No, Sophie tried harder than anyone he had ever seen. But effort alone wasn't enough in Matthew's world. She needed to be sharp, fast, and precise. A month had passed since she started, and Matthew found himself watching her every move, waiting for her to make that inevitable mistake. Her first week was an absolute disaster. She misplaced his meetings, sent the wrong emails, and even mixed up the details of an important client's request. Matthew, as expected, was irritated. But for some reason, he didn't fire her. Maybe it was because she reminded him of something he hadn't seen in a long time: determination. He didn't know it yet, but Sophie was about to show him that there was more to her than met the eye. The morning of the second week, Sophie arrived to work early. Matthew had already arrived, as usual, and he could hear the click of her heels as she made her way to the desk. He glanced up, his expression unreadable. "You're early," he said, his voice cool and businesslike. Sophie smiled nervously, but there was a fire in her eyes. "I'm trying to do better, Mr. Blackwell. I know I made mistakes, but I'm not giving up." Matthew raised an eyebrow. "Not giving up, huh? We'll see about that." He returned his gaze to the papers in front of him. But something about Sophie's unwavering resolve caught his attention. As the day went on, Sophie began to surprise him. She didn't just take notes, she was actually offering insights. When a problem came up with a presentation, she quickly suggested an alternative approach, one that hadn't even occurred to Matthew. It wasn't flawless, but it worked. And Matthew, who prided himself on being the smartest person in the room, felt a strange sense of respect growing for this girl who had yet to win his favor. She was clumsy, yes, but there was a raw talent there, something unpolished but promising. And that unsettled him. As the weeks went on, Sophie's clumsiness didn't disappear. She still tripped over her words during meetings, still spilled her coffee at least once a week, and still made mistakes. But she kept pushing through. And with every failure, she came back stronger, more creative, and more determined. Her persistence was something Matthew couldn't ignore, no matter how hard he tried. One afternoon, a major client walked into the office for a meeting, and everything was going wrong. The presentation slides were corrupted, the coffee machine had broken down, and the room was too cold. Matthew had expected Sophie to fall apart, but instead, she stood up. Without missing a beat, she got the room warmed up, fixed the presentation in minutes, and even managed to make the client laugh. By the time the meeting ended, the client was impressed, and Matthew couldn't deny it. He was impressed too. Something had shifted. Sophie had earned his respect, not by being perfect, but by being real. She wasn't afraid to make mistakes, but she always learned from them. And slowly, but surely, Matthew found himself looking at her differently. Not as a failure, but as someone who might just be exactly what he needed. Weeks passed, and something inside the office began to change. Matthew Blackwell, the ruthless CEO who had once seen Sophie Thompson as nothing more than a clumsy, temporary assistant, started to notice her in ways he never thought possible. He still kept his distance, his cold demeanor never wavering. But Sophie's persistence had begun to wear down his defenses. She had made mistake after mistake, yet each time, she came back stronger. It wasn't her perfection that caught his attention, it was her refusal to give up. One morning, after a particularly challenging meeting with a client, Matthew found himself in his office staring out of the large glass windows, his mind racing. The deal had almost fallen apart, but Sophie had stepped in, offering a solution that no one else had thought of. Her idea wasn't perfect, but it worked. It was the kind of thinking that Matthew respected, even if he was too proud to admit it. Sophie had saved the day, but she had done more than that. She had earned his respect. It was subtle at first, an almost imperceptible shift in the way he regarded her. When Sophie entered his office with a new report, he didn't snap at her for being late. Instead, he nodded and listened as she explained her findings. Her voice was confident, yet her hands still shook slightly as she handed him the papers. She was nervous, but she was getting better, and that was something Matthew hadn't expected. As the days went by, their interactions became less tense. Matthew still kept a certain distance, but Sophie didn't seem to mind. She focused on her work, learning more about the intricacies of the company and gradually becoming an indispensable part of the team. But there were still moments of tension. One afternoon, as Matthew walked into the conference room for a big presentation, he found Sophie nervously setting up the slides. The pressure was on. The client had high expectations, and Matthew knew the slightest mistake could ruin everything. Sophie was the last person he expected to hold it together, but when the meeting began, she stood tall, confident despite the storm of nerves inside her. She presented the information flawlessly, answering questions with poise, and even managing to win over the client with her charm and wit. As the meeting wrapped up, Matthew couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration. Sophie had done it. She had proved him wrong. For the first time, Matthew wasn't just impressed with her ability to handle a tough situation. He was beginning to realize that there was something more to Sophie than he had ever thought. She wasn't just his assistant anymore. She was someone who could match him, someone who could challenge him. And that thought, more than anything else, was what made Matthew Blackwell pause. As the client left the room, Matthew looked at Sophie. "You did well," he said, his voice softer than usual. Sophie, caught off guard, blinked at him in surprise. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell." She didn't know what to say. The words he had just spoken were more than she had ever expected to hear from him. It was a turning point, a small step, but one that held more meaning than Sophie could have known. Matthew turned to leave, but for the first time, he didn't rush. He walked slowly, his mind occupied with the woman who had somehow managed to surprise him every single day. He had never been one to admit his mistakes, but he knew, deep down, that Sophie Thompson was no longer the same person who had stumbled into his office months ago. She had grown, and so had his feelings toward her. The days passed, and the tension that had once defined the atmosphere between Matthew and Sophie began to ease. It wasn't perfect, but the cracks in their relationship, once filled with frustration and misunderstandings, were slowly being repaired by something neither of them expected: mutual respect. Matthew continued to be his usual, intimidating self, but Sophie had earned a quiet place in his world. They no longer had the intense confrontations they once did. Now, the interactions were different, subtle, but meaningful. Sophie still made her fair share of mistakes, but each time, she grew a little stronger, a little more confident. Matthew had stopped hovering over her every move. Instead, he began to give her more space to work on her own, trusting her abilities in ways he never had with anyone else. One afternoon, Matthew found himself in a situation he hadn't planned for. The company was preparing for a major merger, a deal that could make or break everything they had worked for. He had spent weeks organizing every detail, meticulously ensuring that nothing could go wrong. But as the meeting with the investors approached, something unexpected happened. Sophie came to him with a suggestion, her voice shaky but determined. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, "I think there's something you're missing. I was looking over the projections, and I believe there's a better way we could present the financial outlook." Matthew, surprised by her boldness, glanced up from his papers. "What do you mean?" Sophie hesitated, then explained her thoughts clearly, suggesting a different approach to the presentation that she believed would help the investors understand the risks in a way they hadn't considered. Matthew, usually the one in control, felt a flicker of doubt. She was right. He hadn't noticed the discrepancy in the numbers, and her idea could very well be the key to getting the investors on board. It wasn't perfect, but it was something he hadn't seen before. "All right," Matthew said, his voice serious, but there was a hint of respect in his tone. "Let's see what you've got." The meeting was fast approaching, and time was running out. Sophie worked quickly, adjusting the slides and preparing a new presentation based on her suggestions. Matthew observed her, a small part of him impressed by how she handled the pressure. As the investors filed into the room, Matthew's usual cool composure remained intact, but this time, Sophie was by his side, confident and poised. The presentation went smoothly, and when it was over, the investors seemed impressed. The numbers worked, and Sophie's approach had made a difference. Matthew, for the first time in weeks, allowed himself a small smile of approval. The deal was signed, and the company had secured its future. As the investors left, Matthew turned to Sophie. "You did well," he said, the words coming easily now. Sophie smiled, though she was still a bit overwhelmed by the praise. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell." There was a brief silence between them, and for the first time, Sophie could feel something shifting in the air. She wasn't just an assistant anymore. She had earned her place beside him, and for the first time, Matthew saw her as someone who could stand with him, not beneath him. It was a small moment, but it was enough to change everything. From that day forward, their relationship was different. It wasn't just about work anymore. There was a new understanding between them. Sophie had earned Matthew's respect, and for him, that was a bigger accomplishment than any business deal. As the weeks continued to pass, the once clear lines between Matthew and Sophie began to blur. The rigid professional distance that had once defined their relationship was slowly being replaced with something more nuanced, something neither of them had expected. Sophie had earned his respect, but there was something else, a quiet acknowledgement between them that felt different than anything they had shared before. It was not just the way he looked at her now, with a certain softness in his gaze that had never been there before, but the way their interactions had become more natural. Sophie was still Sophie, clumsy, quirky, and sometimes a little too bold, but there was a quiet strength in her that Matthew couldn't ignore. She was no longer just the assistant who made mistakes. She was someone who held her own in the world he had built, and that was no small feat. It was late one evening, and the office was quiet, save for the sound of Sophie typing away at her desk. The building was nearly empty, and most of the staff had gone home for the night. Matthew stood in the doorway of her office, watching her for a moment before speaking. "Sophie," he said, his voice soft but firm. She looked up from her work, startled by his sudden presence. "Yes, Mr. Blackwell?" she asked, quickly standing up, though she was unsure what to expect. "I need you to stay for a little while longer. There are some things we need to go over before tomorrow's meeting," Matthew said, his tone calm and commanding, as usual. Sophie nodded without hesitation. "Of course, I'm happy to help," she replied. As the night wore on, the two of them worked side by side, fine-tuning the details of the upcoming presentation. There was something different in the air now, an unspoken understanding between them that had evolved from mere professional respect into something more. Sophie no longer felt like a nervous assistant in his presence, but someone who was truly contributing to the success of the company. Matthew, for the first time, began to realize how much he had come to rely on her. The meeting the next morning went smoothly, and everything was in place. The clients were impressed, and the deal went through without a hitch. As the day came to a close, Matthew turned to Sophie, his usual guarded expression replaced with a look of quiet satisfaction. "You did well today," he said. Sophie, surprised by the praise, smiled softly. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell." They stood there for a moment, an awkward silence hanging in the air before Matthew spoke again. "I'm not usually one to give compliments, but you've earned it." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She had worked hard for this moment, and hearing those words from him meant more than she had expected. "I appreciate that," she said quietly. For a moment, their eyes met, and Sophie couldn't help but feel a strange warmth in her chest. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, something she couldn't quite define. Matthew looked away first, breaking the moment. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be another long day." Sophie nodded, still processing his words. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. It was subtle, but it was there. Matthew had always been a man of few words, but in that brief exchange, she had seen a side of him that was different, more human, more real. It was a side of him that Sophie had never expected to see. But now, she couldn't help but wonder what it meant for the future of their relationship. The days following the meeting were a quiet whirlwind of productivity. Sophie had become an indispensable part of the team, and Matthew could no longer deny that she had exceeded his expectations in ways he hadn't thought possible. Still, there was something unsettling about the shift that had taken place between them. Sophie wasn't just his assistant anymore. She was someone he relied on, someone he trusted. And that, more than anything, made Matthew uncomfortable. He had always prided himself on being in control, always being the one who made the decisions, the one who held all the cards. But Sophie had a way of making him question that. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something about her presence, her quiet confidence, challenged the way he had built his world. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate her contributions. Quite the opposite. He had come to rely on her in ways he never thought possible. But now, every time he saw her, a small voice in the back of his mind wondered if it was more than just professional admiration. Sophie, for her part, was also aware of the subtle change in their dynamic. It wasn't that she had suddenly become enamored with Matthew, though she couldn't deny there was a certain pull she felt toward him. It was more that she had begun to see him differently, not just as the intimidating CEO, but as a man who had his own vulnerabilities, his own challenges. He wasn't invincible, and that realization brought a sense of relief, but also confusion. She had worked with other powerful men before, but Matthew was different. There was something about the way he carried himself, his stoic demeanor, that made it easy to forget that he was human too. But over the past few weeks, Sophie had seen glimpses of a man who struggled, who second-guessed himself, just like everyone else. And that, in a strange way, made him more relatable. One evening, after a particularly long day at the office, Matthew invited Sophie to stay late to help him prepare for an important investor dinner. The office was quiet, with only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the rustling of papers breaking the silence. As the hours passed, the tension between them seemed to melt away, replaced by an unspoken understanding. Sophie worked diligently, her focus sharp as she adjusted the presentation materials. Matthew, for once, was not micromanaging her every move. Instead, he sat back, watching her work with an almost relaxed expression. It was a rare moment for him, a moment where he didn't feel the need to be in control of every little detail. Sophie looked up from her work to find Matthew watching her. Their eyes met, and for a brief second, there was something unspoken between them. a shared connection that neither of them had been willing to acknowledge before. It was fleeting, a mere moment, but it lingered in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of something neither of them was ready to confront. "You're good at this," Matthew said finally, breaking the silence. Sophie smiled, though she could feel her heart racing. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell. I just want to do my best." There was a pause before Matthew spoke again, his voice softer than usual. "I know you do, and that's why I trust you." Sophie didn't know what to say. She had never expected those words from him. In all the time they had worked together, she had never imagined that Matthew Blackwell would ever say something like that to her. It wasn't just the praise, it was the sincerity in his voice that took her by surprise. For a moment, they stood there, both unsure of how to proceed. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, and it felt as if everything had changed in that instant. But neither of them was ready to address it. Sophie gathered her things, trying to ignore the fluttering feeling in her chest. "I'll finish this up, and then I'll head out," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. Matthew nodded, his gaze lingering on her a moment longer than usual. "Take care of yourself, Sophie," he said quietly. As she walked out of the office that night, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that everything had shifted. The lines between them were no longer so clear, and though neither of them was ready to admit it, something had changed. And from that moment on, Sophie couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and the constant hum of activity that defined life at Blackwell Enterprises. Matthew had grown accustomed to the steady rhythm of his days, but something had shifted within him that he couldn't quite place. Sophie was no longer just the assistant who stumbled through her tasks. She had become someone he looked to for guidance, someone whose opinion mattered. It wasn't something Matthew was used to. He had always trusted himself, relied on his own judgment, and had never allowed anyone, especially not an assistant, to influence his decisions. But Sophie had a way of making him stop and think. He found himself asking her opinion more often, seeking her thoughts on strategies, and even listening to her suggestions during meetings. It was subtle at first, but over time, he began to recognize that her ideas were often the missing pieces he had been searching for. One afternoon, as they sat in the conference room, Matthew reviewed the financial reports for the upcoming quarter. He had been staring at the same numbers for hours, trying to find a way to increase profits without alienating their clients. Sophie, who had been quietly working on another project across the room, suddenly spoke up. "Have you considered offering a new service?" she asked, her voice calm but confident. Matthew looked up, surprised. He had been so focused on the financials that he hadn't thought about expanding the scope of their business. "What do you mean?" he asked, leaning forward. Sophie explained her idea, a new service aimed at helping clients streamline their operations through technology, something that could be a game changer in their industry. It wasn't a completely new concept, but the way she framed it, the way she thought about how it could fit within the company's existing structure, made Matthew realize that it was exactly what they needed. "That's actually a good idea," he said, his tone softer than usual. Sophie smiled slightly, though there was a touch of uncertainty in her eyes. "I think it could work," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But only if we do it right." Matthew nodded, his thoughts already racing as he began to map out the next steps. For the first time in a long while, he felt like they were on the brink of something big. As the day wore on, the two of them continued to work together, the silence between them no longer awkward but comfortable, as though they had found a rhythm that worked. The idea began to take shape, and by the end of the day, Matthew felt a sense of excitement building within him. It wasn't just the potential of the new service, but the way Sophie had challenged him to think differently. He hadn't realized how much he needed that push until now. The next morning, as they prepared for a meeting with potential investors, Matthew found himself standing in front of the mirror in his office, adjusting his tie, his mind still on the conversation he had with Sophie the day before. He knew the presentation had to be perfect, nothing could go wrong. But as he ran through the slides in his mind, he found himself thinking about Sophie, about how far she had come since she first started. She wasn't just the assistant anymore. She was a partner, a collaborator, and it felt right. The investors arrived, and the meeting began. Matthew did most of the talking, as usual, but this time, Sophie was there by his side, her presence steady and supportive. Every time she spoke, offering insights and suggestions, Matthew felt a sense of pride swell inside him. She wasn't just presenting her ideas. She was helping him shape the future of the company. When the meeting ended, the investors seemed impressed, and Matthew couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. But it was more than just the deal. It was the way Sophie had stood by him, the way they had worked together as equals. For the first time, Matthew realized that they made a great team. And that realization, more than anything else, left him feeling something he hadn't expected: hope. As they walked out of the conference room, Matthew turned to Sophie, his voice soft but genuine. "Thank you," he said, meeting her eyes. "For everything." Sophie looked at him, surprised by his words. "I'm just doing my job," she said, though a smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. Matthew smiled back, the weight of the moment not lost on him. It wasn't just business anymore. It was something more. And for the first time in a long time, Matthew Blackwell felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone in this after all. The weeks that followed the investor meeting were filled with a new sense of purpose. The business was flourishing, and the idea that Sophie had suggested, expanding into new services, was gaining momentum. Matthew had never been one to let his guard down, but there was something about the way Sophie worked that made him rethink everything he had always believed. She had a way of seeing things he couldn't, of pushing him to think beyond his usual boundaries. And now, more than ever, Matthew realized just how much he had come to depend on her. He found himself seeking her input more frequently, not just on work matters, but on everything. The once cold, professional distance between them had gradually faded into something more collaborative, more human. They spent late nights at the office together, brainstorming ideas, solving problems, and making plans for the future. Sophie had become not just his assistant, but his most trusted confidant. One evening, as the office grew quiet, Matthew looked across the desk at Sophie. She was focused on a set of reports, her brow furrowed in concentration. There was a soft hum of the city in the background, the last few employees trickling out as the clock ticked past midnight. Matthew had always prided himself on his ability to handle stress, to stay in control no matter what. But tonight, something was different. He found himself watching Sophie, noticing the way the soft light illuminated her face, the way she bit her lip in thought. She wasn't just a colleague anymore. She had become something more, something Matthew wasn't entirely ready to admit. He cleared his throat, and Sophie looked up, startled. "Is something wrong, Mr. Blackwell?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with concern. Matthew hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to articulate the shift in his feelings. "No, everything is fine," he said, his voice steady. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything. The past few months wouldn't have gone as smoothly without you." Sophie smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes. "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Blackwell. You've always known what you were doing. I just try to keep up." There was a hint of humility in her voice, but Matthew could see the pride in her eyes. She wasn't just following his lead anymore. She was taking ownership of her role, and it showed. There was a quiet moment between them, a shift that neither could ignore. Matthew knew that his feelings for Sophie had changed. He could no longer separate the professional from the personal. She had wormed her way into his life in ways that made him feel vulnerable, exposed. And for the first time in a long time, Matthew wasn't sure how to handle that feeling. "You've come a long way," Matthew said, his tone softer than usual. "I never expected this from you." Sophie raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice light, but filled with a hint of intrigue. Matthew leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "When you first started, I never thought you'd last more than a month," he admitted, his gaze meeting hers. "You proved me wrong. And now, well, I can't imagine the company without you." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She had always known Matthew to be blunt, even harsh at times, but there was something different in his words now. Something that made her realize just how much she had come to mean to him. "Thank you," she whispered, not quite sure what else to say. Matthew nodded, his expression serious but soft. "No, thank you, Sophie," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "You've changed everything here. I've changed because of you." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, filled with understanding. For the first time, Sophie realized that Matthew wasn't just the powerful CEO. He was a man who had been transformed by her presence, by her unyielding determination and loyalty. And in that moment, Sophie understood that she wasn't just working for him anymore. They were partners in this journey. And while neither of them was ready to fully confront what had grown between them, they both knew that something had shifted. Something big. And as the night wore on, Sophie couldn't help but wonder where this new dynamic would take them next. The following weeks brought even more changes. Sophie had truly become an integral part of Blackwell Enterprises, and it wasn't just her professional growth that was noticeable. Matthew found himself starting to rely on her in ways he had never expected. Their partnership had blossomed into something far beyond a mere work relationship. It was strange, really, something neither of them had planned for. The early days, when Sophie had first started working for him, had been filled with tension. He had expected her to fail, to fall short of his unreasonably high standards. But she hadn't. Instead, she had risen to the challenge and continued to impress him in ways he couldn't deny. It wasn't just her work ethic or her creativity. It was the way she saw the world. Sophie had a unique perspective that made him pause and reconsider his own. She had pushed him to be better, not just as a businessman, but as a person. Matthew didn't realize how much she had changed him until one morning when he was walking into the office. He noticed her at her desk, completely focused, her eyes scanning through documents. There was a calm determination about her that he admired. She wasn't the same nervous assistant she had been when she first started. She had become confident, capable, and almost indispensable. For a moment, Matthew simply stood there, watching her. It was as if he was seeing her for the first time again. Sophie, sensing his presence, looked up. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwell," she said, offering him a small smile. "Morning," he replied, his voice softer than usual. He hadn't meant to stare, but he couldn't help it. Sophie had a way of making everything seem more real. He had never thought about his life beyond the business, beyond the deals and the power. But Sophie had changed that. He realized now that he couldn't just rely on his work to fill the emptiness inside him. And for the first time, he was okay with that. As the day went on, Matthew found himself drifting back to thoughts of Sophie. There was something different between them now. It was no longer just respect. It was something deeper. He knew he couldn't continue to pretend that everything was strictly professional. The lines had blurred. Later that evening, after a particularly successful board meeting, Matthew invited Sophie to join him for a drink at a nearby restaurant. It was rare for him to mix business with personal life, but tonight, he felt it was the right thing to do. Sophie hesitated for a moment before agreeing. Her curiosity piqued. As they sat across from each other in the dimly lit restaurant, Matthew finally broke the silence. "I've been thinking," he started, his tone serious, "about everything. About you, about us, and what we've built together." Sophie looked at him, her heart racing. She didn't know where this conversation was going, but she had a feeling that it was going to change things between them. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice soft. Matthew paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. "I never imagined that I'd be in this position, working so closely with someone, trusting them the way I trust you," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "I don't just rely on you for work. I value you as a person. You've become important to me." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected that something had shifted between them, but hearing him say it aloud was a different thing entirely. "Matthew," she began, unsure of how to respond. I don't know what to say." He smiled, a rare moment of vulnerability showing in his eyes. "You don't have to say anything," he replied. "I just needed you to know." There was a silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if the weight of unspoken feelings had finally been lifted. They both knew that the dynamic between them had changed, but neither was ready to fully define what that meant. Yet, for the rest of the evening, they simply enjoyed each other's company, the conversation flowing easily. No more walls, no more distance, just two people who had built something together, something real. As the night drew to a close, Matthew walked Sophie to her car. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said, his voice low. Sophie smiled, feeling the warmth of his words wrap around her. "See you tomorrow." And as she drove home that night, Sophie couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. Whatever came, she knew they would face it together.